To those who flew her, she was the finest gun platform ever built. To those who engaged her, she was the most formidable opponent ever met. Ever wonder who was her most proficient and masterful technician? Well, this is our story of Major George E. Preddy, Jr., the highest-scoring P-51 Mustang ace of World War II. You might imagine that the deeds of one whose expertise was so outstanding would almost have become commonplace in the annals of aviation history. But this is not the case, for only in recent years have the facts of this outstanding fighter pilot come to light. Now the story of Major George E. Preddy, Jr., the Mustang ace, can be told by those who grew up with him and flew with him. George Preddy was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, on February 5, 1919, the first child of 4 by George and Clara Preddy. Early in his life, he was characterized as being a competitive intellectual. He had a great desire to excel at tennis and basketball, but carrying only 120 pounds on his 5-foot 9-inch frame, had difficulty competing in the school programs. Not to be outdone, he organized his own team of buddies from the local Y and challenged the high school to a match, and they almost won.
George was a good student in high school. He was an avid reader, always reading on many subjects. He read quite a bit at home. And not that he was all work and no play, he was a well-rounded person. He was always, from boyhood, a very stable and mature person. He set goals for himself and tenaciously strived to accomplish what he expected of himself. He was interested in flying at a very early age. At 19, he had his first flight with a friend, and after that, he said that was the most wonderful experience he had ever had, and he must become an aviator.
George got out of high school as age 16, which would make it about 1935. Soon thereafter, he took up flying lessons. A fellow named Bill Teague taught him to fly, and not long thereafter, they bought a Waco 10 biplane. I vividly recall George's first experience in that plane because it ended up as a small tragedy. He had a taxiing accident and rubbed wingtips with Bill Teague, who was flying another plane at the time. So my first experience repairing airplanes came there, helping George repair the wingtip. But George used that plane in the summer of 1940 to do his barnstorming. He and Bill Teague went around the state of North Carolina on 2 separate barnstorming tours. Then in 40, he also started trying very hard to get into the Navy Air Corps. And he took the physical and the mental exams and did all right on the mental, but he couldn't pass the physical. He had a curvature of the spine. They said it was too small and too young. Come back later. Well, after 2 more trips back, he decided to try for the Army Air Corps. And while waiting for his turn there, he joined the Air National Guard, which almost turned out to be the mistake because he was just before being shipped to Puerto Rico when he got his orders to join the Air Corps. And they shipped him to a civilian training base, Dar Aerotech, down in Georgia, where he took primary training. And then he went on to Craig Field for advanced training. That was in Alabama. Flew the AT-6, which he really liked. And it turns out that that was a good training vehicle for the P-51. So then he graduated from flying school December 12, 1941, just 5 days after Pearl Harbor.
Upon graduation, Preddy was assigned to the 9th Squadron of the 49th Pursuit Group and traveled by train to the West Coast for his first assignment.
Within 30 days, he was on board the USS Mariposa, headed for parts unknown in the Pacific, but turned out to be Australia. And of course, all the guys on board ship were guessing all the time, where are we going, you know? The destination was to be Sydney, but they ended up in Melbourne. And then they were shipped up by train to Sydney within the first couple of weeks. And the P-40s were assembled that had been shipped over by boat. And the guys started getting their first experience flying P-40s after they got to Australia. He had never flown one before. The closest he'd come to it was a P-36.
Conditions at Darwin were not what the members of the 49th Pursuit Group had expected. Home was a tent in an area cut out of the jungle. Maintenance was performed in the opening in the forest. The runway was a 6,000-foot strip bordered on all sides by tall timbers. It was here that Preddy named his first aircraft Tar Heel, appropriately for his home state. His developing tenacity in battle was depicted by a fire-breathing dragon painted on the aircraft.
Living in the jungles must have been much of a hardship from his diary, but he accepted it well. He minimized hardships, and that was part of his nature.
His first and only encounter with the enemy happened on April 27th when he engaged a Zero and a Mitsubishi bomber. And his comment was he couldn't get a decent shot at them, but he did put some indecent holes in them, so he racked up a claim for 2 aircraft damaged, but not destroyed. It was in July 1942 that George was engaged in a training mission that just about killed him. He was flying as a guinea pig for the other pilots to dive at, as if George was simulating an enemy bomber, and the friends would dive at him and pretend to shoot him down. Well, a fellow named Sauber, Lieutenant Sauber, misjudged his dive and clipped off Preddy's tail. And the collision killed Sauber, we think, probably immediately, and at least he didn't get out of his airplane. George was able to bail out of his airplane and landed near an anthill after hitting a tree on the way down, and he was pretty badly hurt.
But in his letter home, he said he had cuts and scratches. They were severe enough to cause him to be taken to Melbourne to a hospital, had much skin grafting done, and spent approximately 6 weeks at the hospital there. He took that well also. In his letters home, there was no complaining. Just wanted to get back into the air.
Healed of his wounds, George Preddy returned to the States, only to cross the continent 6 times in search of his next assignment.
Ended up at Mitchell, assigned to the 34th Fighter Squadron, and in that squadron already were a couple of guys from his old 9th Pursuit Squadron in Australia. One of them was I.B. Jack Donaldson. Well, it turned out I.B. had recommended George Preddy to John Meyer to get that guy in the squadron, in 352nd and the 487th Squadron. So Meyer saw Preddy and questioned Donaldson. What do you mean, get that guy? He's scrawny and little. You sure he can fly? Well, Donaldson assured him he could fly. So Meyer hired Preddy, as it were, and Preddy became a flight leader for John Meyer, and also quite a competitor because, as John Meyer later said, George pressed him into a lot of training that Meyer would not have gotten otherwise. George wanted to work as hard as he could, and did. He was very dedicated to improving his skills.
At Mitchell Field, we started to get to know George, and he told us about the time when he was over in the Far East. They hadn't had any meat for a long time, and George went out and shot a cow, and they all had a steak, he said, but he had to pay for the cow. We were all busy flying as much as we could. The idea was to basically get as much time in the P-47 as we could, and also to get chocked out in firing the guns and gunnery. We did have some gunnery at Far Island, ground gunnery, and as best I remember, no air-to-air gunnery, and we had to fire the gun above, I think it was 40,000 feet. We lost a few pilots at least one at Mitchell Field, and we had one pilot who mistaked Roosevelt Field for Mitchell Field and landed a P-47 at Roosevelt Field and had to have it trucked back to Mitchell Field. That was at the time, and when he got back, Major Meyer was a little upset about it, and we were having a party at a brewery that Meyer had arranged. And at the party, he awarded Lieutenant Nutter, the pilot, the first award that I know of that anybody in the 34th or 487th received, and it was like a pin of a flying ruptured duck with the wings outspread and you know what hanging below.
More practice gunnery was to follow while the group waited for shipping orders. Preddy, not to be left out, got a royal chewing from the group commander for putting on a low-level acrobatic demonstration just days before they finally boarded ship on June 30th, 1943, bound for England.
We got off the boat, the Queen Elizabeth, and proceeded by train to a little town of Watton. Of course, we didn't know what it was, and Bodney Air Base.
The airfield at Bodney is on slightly rolling land located midway between Norwich and King's Inn. 26 tarmac hardstands were located around the perimeter of the field. The technical area was on the west side of the field. The officers were initially housed in Nissen huts, but were later transferred into a most comfortable state house nearby. Quite a change for Preddy, whose previous living experience had been in the jungles of Darwin.
We started getting our first P-47s in the European theater. I think we were the 5th group in Europe at the time. And we got another one, and George took the airplane off and proceeded to give us a buzz job. As he went across the field, he pulled it up into slow roll, or barrel roll rather, and as he barrel rolled, there was no problem and he kept going up. The only thing was he still had his landing gear down. I don't think he ever did really live that one down. After that, we proceeded to build up as much time as it could, and I flew quite a bit with George. We'd go out, and you could go out almost any time. You weren't scheduled for something else and fly. On one mission that I remember, we'd been out just flying and practice dogfighting, and when we landed it was getting late in the evening and we wanted to get down. The weather was turning a little bit sour, and when we landed, George landed a little bit long and I was on his wing and I landed just a little bit longer. When we landed, we didn't think anything about it, at least I didn't, and we walked over to the operations hut. As we got there, Major Meyer came up to us and said, "Ham, you fellows landed a little long, didn't you?" And I told him I didn't think it was too bad, and the weather was getting bad, and I just wanted to get on the ground. He says, "Well, here's a foot ruler. You and George go measure that runway, and you tell me just how long it is." Of course, George didn't want to do it. He was then a major, and I was a captain, and he was the operations officer. I told him, "George, we better do it, or we'll probably do it twice." So we actually went out and with a 1-foot ruler measured the length of the runway and reported to Meyer at the Officers Club. It shocked me at the time, but I guess it also learned me a lesson. Probably George too.
It should be noted that this incident took place at night, with a flashlight being the sole source of illumination. The new group's first missions were, for the most part, uneventful. It was only proper for Major John C. Meyer, Preddy's commanding officer, to get the unit's first victory on November 26, 43. Preddy noted in his diary, "I know that my day is coming, and I am going to do everything possible to be ready when I do meet the Luftwaffe. Starting right now, I'm going to get in top physical and flying condition." Tradition has it that an aircraft really belongs to the crew chief, and pilots on occasion are permitted to fly them. J.J. Red McVeigh was Major Preddy's assistant crew chief and had the awesome responsibility of keeping his aircraft in tip-top shape. This relationship was to last almost a year. Preddy never had to abort a mission because of faulty equipment. Red's first encounter with Preddy almost turned out to be his last.
When I reported to Bodney, it was confusing to me. My vision of an airfield was always airstrips, hangars. There were no airstrips. There were no hangars. There was one hangar, but it was behind a hill. You never even saw it. You took off, in Bodney, the planes took off up a hill, landed up a hill. In a week or two, I was assigned permanent to Major Preddy's planes, Captain Preddy at the time. Lulan was the crew chief. Mo Kuhanik was the armor. At that time we were with P-47s. They were big monsters that defy imagination. They took 135 gallons an hour, which didn't permit them to go very great distances. Accordingly, although there were lots of missions in the cold, still when they got over the channel, they couldn't go very far. So the Germans just sat back here and waited for the bombers and shot at the bombers. When we eventually transferred to P-51s with the greater range, then the activity started. When I first went to the 487th, I was a roving crew chief, assistant crew chief. On January 20th, which is the first time I can remember ever being left alone on a plane, it turned out to be George Preddy. It was that day that he was shot down by flak and wound up in the North Sea. I was so new to the outfit that I had my little spot there and I waited for George to come back. The plane started coming back and I looked around and George wasn't there. Each time I wanted George to be there because this was my first day. It never came. Finally it got dark and all the planes were back now but George's. No one said anything to me, and finally someone passing said to me, what are you doing? I said, I'm waiting for George Preddy's plane to come back, Captain Preddy. Oh, they said he was shot down in the channel. That was, I sat there and for another 15, 20 minutes to try and think through what did I do? What could I possibly have done that could cause it? Of course, I was to later find out that he was shot down by flak.
Although Preddy did have to ditch his Thunderbolt in the English Channel, he had just scored his third of 27.5 aerial and 5 ground victories that would follow in aircraft all named Cripes-A-Mighty. Why this name?
Most of us were from the north. George, in the main, was, I considered him, because I was so close to him, and day to day, that I considered him our southern gentleman. And I always thought that that's as much as the man swore. Now, there may be other reasons, but I never heard him say an unkind word to me. I never heard him say a cross word to anybody where I was.
Preddy and his Thunderbolt would fly many missions after the January 29th ditching incident without further success. During the first week of April, his luck would begin to change as the 352nd transitioned over to the P-51 Mustang. Preddy named this one Cripes-A-Mighty also, and within 2 weeks, he had his 4th and 5th victories, gaining for him the designation of Ace. Preddy quickly adapted to the greater maneuverability and quickness of the Mustang. By the end of May, his P-51 would be carrying 10.83 victories. 28 April, Bourges, France. 30 April, Clermont-Ferrand, France. 12 May, the Airdrome at Halle. 13 May, Neubrandenburg, Germany. 21 May, Neubrandenburg, Germany. 30 May, Magdeburg, Germany. Just prior to D-Day, Preddy would receive his most famous Mustang, Cripes-A-Mighty III. It was the latest version with the new high-visibility bubble canopy. In it, he would rack up 17 additional victories by the first week in August. As a member of the 352nd, you may have become slowly aware of the impending invasion of Europe at Normandy by having kept tabs of the increasing number of flights that were being flown during the weeks preceding June 6th. Each unit would face its own unique problems.
Well, we closed the field for a couple days before D-Day. No one was allowed on the field. No one was allowed off the field. We were painting the alternate black, white, and black stripes. No one was allowed off the field. No one was allowed on the field. This was to be kept strictly secret. We were all waiting for this day to come for years and years. When it came, we were all excited, everyone. And the pilots came out 1, 2 o'clock in the morning with the instructions to fly as long as they could, stay in the air. At takeoff, the planes went down to the southeast corner. They would take off across our hilly field, up the hill toward northeast. They lined up. They were down the hill so we couldn't see them. We could hear the noise, and then they came. There was no lights allowed, no lights. They had never flown at night. It was totally new to them. They started up the field. We were all shouting, cheering, and then all hell broke loose. One of the planes hit directly into the control tower which was being built. Lieutenant Frascati of the 486th was killed. It was easy takeoff then because it was light. It was daylight. But that was a hell of a price to pay for an ease of taking off. The pilots came back after flying as much as 10 hours. Then they were relieved. We did our maintenance on it, put another pilot right back in and stayed up there. Now, some of these pilots on D-Day who flew our planes had never flown a P-51 before. Some of them had been at parties 3 or 4 days before in New York. Some of those were killed in accidents.
By now, Captain Preddy had completed his normal operational tour of 200 hours and was eligible to go home. Like others, he felt that he must stay and continue in the unit's mission, the softening up of the landing area by strafing German support elements. He would christen his new 51 to action on June 6th. The 487th would fly 9 missions in 3 days. He would fly 3 of these. 5 of Preddy's pilots would be lost on these support missions. Much damage was inflicted. The Germans knew that the Allies had come to stay. On June 12th, the 352nd would resume giving the 8th Air Force bombers support in the Wren area. Krieps-Amity would score victory number 13. The blend of the pilot and the aircraft would really come to an apex in the weeks that followed. 10 additional victories would be added to Preddy's record on June 20th, 21st, 29th, and July 18th. Success has been known to make profound changes in people, but not so with George Preddy.
George was a quiet man to us. He didn't ask much. I just never understood whether the planes, all the planes he flew were perfect, or whether George didn't want to have any plane of his out of action for maintenance problems so that he wouldn't be able to fly that day. One time, Lieutenant Colonel Meyer flew it while George was on leave, and he came back, and all the curse words that George never uttered, he uttered them all to me. And what it turned out was that although he shot 4 planes that day down with George's plane, he strafed them, it didn't fire straight. It fired low or high, and that bothered him. George, I asked another pilot one time why that didn't bother George. He said it didn't bother George because he got right up behind the plane and pulled the trigger.
Sometimes success can breed a bit of overconfidence, which can be very frustrating. Take the July 18th mission to Rostock.
George and I were flying south in France, and my airplane had a slight miss in it and would not draw the maximum power, but we continued anyway in a southerly direction. Before long, we spotted a single German flying in and out of clouds out ahead of us for 2 or 3 miles. George took off after him, and I couldn't keep up. And I told George I couldn't keep up, but to go ahead and I'd be behind him. George came up on the German and tried to shoot him down. The German ducked into the clouds, and I'd sit back and call out to George where the German was coming out, and George would bounce him again. This happened, I guess, 3, maybe 4 times, and then we lost him. George never did get him, and I think that always upset George.
In spite of the frustration with the 410 that got away, Cripes-A-Mighty would be initially credited with 4 victories that day, bringing his total now to 20.5. More missions were flown in July, with 2.5 additional victories being scored on the 20th on a ramrod to Germany, the 21st, an escort to Magdeburg. And on the 29th, an escort to Naumburg. The month of August would be Major George Preddy's month of months. On the evening of the 5th, after he had successfully scored his 24th victory, he attended a unit party where he participated in a high-stakes crap game, winning a $1,200 pot. He got oiled in the process. With his winnings, he purchased a war bond, which he sent home to his mom. On August 6, 1944, George Preddy's moment in history would occur, for he would be at the right place, at the right moment, and with the right training with which to guarantee his place in history. He would that day establish a European theater of operations record by destroying 6 aircraft in a single mission. Reveille came just 20 minutes after Preddy hit the sack. His problems were just beginning. The previously scrubbed mission was on to Berlin, and he was leading it.
There was no particular air of excitement that day. And when George took off, as usual, I waited.
Preddy, along with Lieutenants Shelton Heyer and Cy Doliak, had just spotted a flight of 30 Me-109s about to jump a 3rd box of B-17s ahead of them at 26,000 feet, when Preddy threw up in his oxygen mask. Feeling very sick and afraid of suffocating, he cleared his mask as best he could and began to take out his frustrations on the enemy aircraft. He reported, "I opened fire on one at the rear of formation from 300 yards and got hits. Score 1. Lieutenant Heyer and I drove up behind another, and I got hits in the wing roots, blazing him. He bailed out. Score 2. Heyer got one to my right. I fired on another at close range, causing him to smoke and then fall apart. Score 3. I hit another with a short burst and he blazed. Score 4. I got good bursts into another, causing him to burn and spin down. Score 5. We were now at 5,000 feet, and I was alone. I went after a single 109 before he could jump me. My initial burst was ineffective. He almost nailed me, but I outclimbed him. He stalled and fell off to the left. I dropped down astern of him. He jettisoned his canopy as I fired a short burst, getting many hits. As I pulled past, he bailed out. Score 6. I lost contact with all friendly and enemy aircraft, so headed home alone. It had all happened in less than 5 minutes.
The wing tank boxes, hundreds of them, were near me. And I had climbed up and would hollow out, take the cases out, put them down there, so that I could get a little more sleep. You have to understand that during D-Day and thereabouts, we slept under the wings of the plane to get 15 more minutes sleep. We didn't have much. So I would go up there. Now George had gotten used to this, and he would come back, break formation, head for the boxes, buzz me, shake the heck out of me. Then I'd get up and go down and greet him. On this day, there was no worry about that, because I was awakened, because there was a big flurry of activity around our hard stand. George, everyone knew, had shot down several planes.
As Cripes a Mighty Third taxied up to Preddy's hard stand, those present knew that both had been in mortal combat. Oil streaks ran from the bottom of the engine compartment, indicating more than usual stress on the aircraft. Pilot and ground crews gathered around and on Preddy's 51. Even the novice could tell that Preddy not only was tired from the ordeal, but was still feeling the effects from the night before. However, he willingly accepted the good wishes from all present and completed the aircraft log for McVeigh. After the crowd dispersed, the squadron painter would come and add 7 more Balkan crosses to Cripes a Mighty. She now displayed 31 victories. For his deeds on this mission, George Ratsy Preddy would be recommended for his nation's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor. The next day, after a good night's rest, he would assist a camera crew from the 8th Fighter Command in the preparation of a PR film depicting the previous day's events. Preddy put on a show with several low passes and really beat up Bodney for the troops. It was only proper that the 51's ground crew be the first to greet their hero. In the absence of Chief Lou Lunn, Red McVeigh, Armorer Mo Kohanek, and several ground crew members were photographed greeting the Major on his victorious return. The unit painter did his artwork one more time. Preddy would not fly Cripes a Mighty Third again, but she would score 10 more victories. On August 11th, an award ceremony was held for Major Preddy, at which he was presented with the nation's second highest decoration, the Distinguished Service Cross, by Brigadier General Edward W. Anderson. After an interview by William Shadell of CBS News, he was ordered to 30 days leave back in the States. After a brief stopover at the Pentagon for interviews by the press, Preddy arrived home to a hero's welcome at his hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina. A celebration was held for him at the War Memorial Stadium, where he had played tennis and run his concession stand named the Mouse Hole. The mayor provided him the opportunity of seeing how well he could handle his T-model Ford. Later in the month, he would travel to Florida to see his brother Bill, who was now finishing up his advanced training in a P-51.
Finally, George got his chance to challenge Bill to a aerial dogfight. So they went up on a practice dogfight. And the result of that, other than being a lot of fun for both of them, was that George thought Bill could take on anything the Luftwaffe had to offer at that time, which really speaks highly for the training that the guys were getting towards the end of the war as compared to what they got initially.
Early in October, Major Preddy would return to the ETO, where he would receive a new challenge, CO of the lowest scoring squadron of his old group, the 328th.
The morale was a little bit low because the other two squadrons were doing better score-wise, and they were, I think, looking down a little bit on the 328th. I had a good impression of George because I'd heard considerable information about his expertise in the past and what he'd been doing in the South Pacific as well as over in the ETO. So our expectations were great for George before he came.
The squadron's first meeting with their new leader was quite revealing.
He seemed to, well, be more cold and calculating. Had a great respect. I could tell right away that we had a man that was going to do a good job for us and would be good leadership quality. But it was a little hard to get to know George right off the bat. As I say, he was just kind of quiet, and it took a while. I think everybody respected him, but it just took a while to get acquainted with him and know what to expect of him. George was probably a loner in some respects. If you got in a small group with him or on a one-to-one basis, he was opened up and would talk. But when he talked, he usually had something to say. It wasn't idle chatter.
In addition to new responsibility, Preddy received a new crew chief and aircraft.
Shortly after he took command, within a day or two, I guess he gathered the squadron all around this bomb shelter. And he got up on top of the shelter and started to just give a short talk as to what we were there for. And I recall him saying that the main thing we were there for was to shoot down the Hun. The aircraft that they gave me to crew for him was a new model, and I don't recall the first time he came down to look at the plane, but I remember very vividly there was a pilot from 487th came over, and it was Lieutenant Myers, Colonel Myers. And he said, boy, he really likes his plane painted up. And of course, I had a good bit of paint on it then. As a matter of fact, fellas used to say, you put any more on it, it won't fly. He never complained about anything. I recall one day he came back and I saw that the guns had been fired. And you could always count that if the guns were fired in his plane, why, he had gotten somebody. So I asked him, what'd you see, Major? He said, nothing but a lot of bad weather. I used to cut hair on the side. I always had the theory it paid to advertise, so I used to paint barber poles on him. He never complained. He thought it was a good thing.
Preddy's pilots would take their new leader's challenge to shoot down the Hun to heart, for on November 2nd, they would set an ETO record of destroying more aircraft on one mission than any other squadron. They destroyed 24. Preddy got an Me-109, making him the highest active ace in the ETO. On November 21st, on his 132nd mission, Preddy would run his aerial victory total to 25 1/2. Poor flying weather would begin during the first week of December and continue for the next 4 weeks. On December the 16th, the Germans launched their offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was on. In response to a request by the 9th Tactical Air Command for additional air coverage for its P-47s, operating near the front at Auch, Belgium, Preddy and Colonel John Meyer would move their squadrons to a field designated as Y-29 on December 23rd.
As I recall, this came, I think it was one morning. They called us into a briefing, and everybody was wondering, what are we going to hear now? And it announced that we were needed over on the continent, and that we were going to move out right away. We were going to take our squadron. We were going to fly in. There would be little, if anything, there except fuel, and we would be sleeping in tents. And so right away, of course, we wondered, now, what's this all about? And they said, well, we have to fly close support. This Battle of the Bulge has broken out, and they need aircraft badly. So they gave us a set of spark plugs and said, you'll have to change your own plugs because we're not going to have the mechanics there, and there will be fuel. There's a fuel dump there, and you're going to get fuel. There's going to be they had cleared out an area strip in the forest and laid down matting, and we would fly in, and there would be somebody there to meet us.
And it was a rough day. I've always been so proud of Duke Lambright's leading us there, because unless you're familiar with the country, slag piles going, say, 100, 125, sticking up in the air. You have to dodge around those. And we were right on the deck, hunting this steel mat.
As we flew over and went to circle to fly into the strip, we got shot at from by the Germans from across the swamp. They weren't too far away, and I don't really know how far it was. It may have been 4 or 5 miles.
It was just an airstrip made out of metal slabs, and out in the woods, no facilities for taking care of the planes or anything. We just kept our stuff in the bag. We had some extra tools and spark plugs and a few very essential things that were needed to keep the plane in operation.
That was primitive living for us. But then, when we settled in the tents with a bucket of coal and the little stove, we got fairly comfortable considering the snow on the ground. The only uncomfortable part was going to the latrine. That was a slit trench with a canvas sides to it.
They put a perimeter around our strip of guards because they said the way things were going, they couldn't promise what was going to happen. And as you know, then the weather socked in. So we sat there in this cloudy weather, and as I recall, some fog and all for several days. And when we were badly needed out to support, then we were flying support for the P-47s that were going to do some dive bombing.
On Christmas afternoon, Preddy and his 328th Squadron would get their first opportunity for action since their arrival at Y-29. Cripes-A-Mighty would lead the 4-element flight, with Carty and Stephen Jane as number 2, Lambright in Geraldine, and Mitchell in Carroll as 3 and 4. For 3 of them, it would be a Christmas they would never forget.
The procedure was we'd take off in a unit element formation and climb like gangbusters till we got to about 12, 15,000, because there was a real danger of being caught with our wheels down, and so to eliminate that, we climbed madly. I believe we were 12 unit, 3-flight squadron that day. And we took off and just stooled around for a while. No action. Radio, while more static than usual, was much better than the day before. We we did have some communication between, but it wasn't perfect by any means. Finally, after about 2.5, 3 hours, the radar vectored us to around the edge, I believe it was southwest of the edge, where they claimed there was some enemy activity. So Major Preddy took off on that heading. And I remember coming up on action, Major Preddy said, well, they started with ours. Let's join them.
As we started forward, then there was so much chatter. The air was full of airplanes, both sides, and the chatter was so loud that you couldn't get on the phone. And so just about the time when he got through with his message, I looked to my left and there was a couple 109s that came out of the sun because they were above us and they were diving. So I tried to call him because I wanted to see if we could get it break right or left and break into him, because I thought, you know, if we continue on our course, they're going to come in on us. So I tried to call and I couldn't raise him. He continued on his course. Well, then he and Carty were in the lead, and they quickly got away from us because I could see these coming in. I was watching them. So Lambright was my element leader, and I was number 4 in the flight. Well, I could see that the first 109 was coming in, diving on him, and I thought, well, there's only one way I can do, and that is to break off just a little bit, slow my speed, and get in behind him if I can. And that's precisely what happened. So I just cut my throttle just enough so that he would overrun me, but still not quite get to Lambright, and he was pretty close to him. So then I gunned it, and I opened fire on him and was able to disable him. He turned over. I don't know as he ever got out, but canopy flew off and he rolled over and went down. Well, by that time I looked back and the other one was coming down on me, and he was pretty close. So I did a tight just pull back, and I did a stall really and flipped over and went down, and I started into a spin. I remember that, and I just let it spin. I wanted to get out of there because I didn't know who else was back there, but I knew that this 109 was close. And I let it go for a long while, and then I finally popped it and got it out. But then I was diving so fast, and I had to use my trim tabs to come back because I couldn't. It was just hard. And I came out somewhere, as I recall, around 5,000 feet.
You know, the dogfight, it's strictly it's a hair-raising experience and an exhilarating experience. Everybody's going round and round, trying to keep everybody else from getting on the tail and trying to connect with somebody ahead of them. Anyway, Major Preddy, being the lead unit, led us right on into it and latched on to one and started Luff Bear. But another 109 cut in front of him, and I don't believe he varied his turn much. He just gave him a burst and then flipped back to his turn. So pilot bailed out. If I remember correctly, the pilot of the first one bailed out, and he went back to his turn, to the original victim, and shot him down. So that was 2 that I was witness of. Then they said there was a 190 on the deck.
Not far from where the aerial battles were taking place, members of the U.S. 12th Anti-Aircraft Unit were tending to the weapons, keeping watch for the Luftwaffe. Captain William S. Cross was standing by a radio at an anti-aircraft site.
On Christmas morning, planes had been flying overhead all day long, since light, trying to attack ground targets beyond our units. There was very little enemy activity in our unit on that morning. We would hear the planes, but couldn't see them because they were above the overcast. From time to time, a plane would come under the overcast, would be identified, and fly off. In this case, the flash signal came that enemy aircraft were coming from the southeast. All the weapons swung in that direction, in that area, and there was sound of any aircraft firing or machine gun firing. Whether it came from a plane or from the ground, it's hard to tell. It's impossible to tell. Anyway, the guns were alerted and swung in that direction, waiting to see the planes coming. We were told there were 2 Me-109s flying in, typical attack, strafing ground targets, typical again. So the guns were alerted to that, they swung in that direction, and suddenly over the trees, 2 planes appeared. There could have been more, but 2 were reported. 2 planes appeared. The gunner on the quadruple 50 caliber machine guns fired a very short burst at these planes. He had only an instant to fire because the planes were flying so fast and the area that he could see them was so limited. We understand that he fired only 60 rounds at that moment, and the weapons had a fire rate of 6,000 rounds a minute. So you can see he simply touched those triggers and immediately recognized then that the plane was friendly and that he had fired on a friendly plane.
We went down and chasing this 190 right on the, I'd say, deck. And we passed a little patch of trees, and then we began to get exceedingly heavy ground fire.
I did see off at a distance what looked like a whole field of golf balls. You know, they had thrown up a huge barrage.
So I took a tracer in the cockpit, and about the same time I saw Major Preddy start Shondell up. But it seemed like halfway through that they gave him another burst that finished him, because he went on over in, just went down.
The plane was hit. It crashed nearby. It was not a terrible crash. It did not go in the nose first in that sense. The gun crew ran to it as fast as they could. It crashed some 500-600 yards away. It had made apparently an effort to pull up, I'm told, and that it wasn't successful, but the plane did not destroy itself when it was damaged, of course. But the pilot could possibly have survived the crash itself. But unfortunately, the pilot had been hit by 50 caliber fire. And it was then that they realized, when we got the dog tags out, that it was a leading ace in the ETO, Major Preddy. You can imagine now how sorrow.
Art Snyder recalls how he received the word of his commander's death.
They encountered many German planes that day, and different fellows, as they would taxi by on the strip, would put one finger up or two, indicating how many they had shot down. And then I recall this one pilot, I can still see the picture in my mind yet. This one pilot went by, not knowing who it was, but he just went with the thumbs down, and I knew what he meant, that the major had had it.
Of course, everybody was pretty well down when they found out that George did not return. And at the end of the day, somebody said, well, they're having dinner over here, they're having Christmas dinner. And I said, Christmas dinner? It was one of those days which we had lost track of time, and I had not even thought about Christmas Day. It was, had been that kind of a day.
Major Preddy's brother Bill completed flight school, was assigned to a P-51 outfit, the 339th Fighter Group. After scoring a confirmed victory on his first encounter with the enemy, Bill would make the supreme sacrifice for his country also. Major Preddy's most famous P-51, Cripes a Mighty Third, would continue to fly combat missions for almost a year, until April 16th, when it would be lost on a strafing mission over the aerodrome at Gonneker, Germany. It would have set a record of having more aerial victories scored in it than any other P-51 in the Second World War, 18.5. It has often been said that in measuring one's success in life, it is not how many years a person lives, but rather what is accomplished with the time he is given. If success is to be measured by decorations, George E. Preddy, Jr. was most successful. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 silver and 1 bronze oak leaf cluster, 7 Air Medals, Purple Heart, and the Croix de Guerre. If it is to be measured by job proficiency, 27.5 aerial victories and 5 grounds rank him the best in his aircraft, 3rd overall among all ETO aces. No one scored more aerial victories in the North American P-51 than he. He was the best he could be to his life's end. His true measure of success is the fact that he gave his country by way of his dedication to duty, his all.